Good afternoon, beautiful people. Today we are talking about the criminal indictment of former FBI Director James Comey and the serious questions now being raised about how this case was handled by the Department of Justice. We're going to walk through what happened and why the judge is grilling the Department of Justice and what this means for the integrity of the justice system. Welcome to Nelly Miranda.
So a federal judge has just ordered prosecutors to turn over all of its grand jury material to Comey's defense team, and they have by the end of the day to get that done. In a ruling, the judge cited what is called disturbing patterns of missteps by the DOJ. Comey has been indicted on 2 charges for lying to Congress and obstruction. The trial is set for January.
As always, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Okay, so the judge in this case is Judge Michael Nachmanoff, and he basically pressed the Department of Justice to explain how the indictment against Comey was even put together. He noted irregularities, confusion, and what he called profound investigative missteps. That's coming from a federal judge looking directly at DOJ lawyers and asking, what exactly are you doing here?
A federal judge has ordered the Justice Department to turn over all grand jury materials to the defense team for former FBI Director James Comey. In a scathing ruling, the judge wrote there was, quote, a disturbing pattern of profound investigative missteps that may require dismissing the case. Comey has pleaded not guilty to obstruction and lying to Congress charges. CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman is following this case and joins us now to discuss. Katrina, I understand there's some new information on this case as well. What's the latest?
Errol, so basically there are 2 judges with this case. One is overseeing the case, and the other one has been dealing with some discovery issues. He's the one who made this decision about turning over the grand jury materials to James Comey. Now, the judge overseeing the case has paused this for now. He wants the government to have an opportunity to respond. They're supposed to respond by Wednesday, so for now, James Comey will not be getting these grand jury materials.
How unusual is it for a judge to issue the kind of statement we just read and order this type of ruling to allow the grand jury secrets effectively to be seen by the other side?
Yeah. Errol, this is extremely unusual. The judge even wrote here that it's an extraordinary remedy, but he does believe there may have been missteps in that grand jury room, and this is such a sanctioned process. He wants to make sure that the integrity of the grand jury proceedings is maintained. He's worried that Lindsay Halligan, the U.S. attorney who brought this case, may have told the grand jury things that just were not true about the criminal process, such as that James Comey couldn't not testify at his own trial. You do have the Fifth Amendment right not to testify at your trial. He also believes she may have told them that they could rely on believing that there's evidence the government would present at the trial that wasn't in the grand jury room. There's some issues with the timeline here, just a number of things that made him concerned about what happened in that room and making sure that the accused has the right to review those materials. This is so rare, though, Errol. It's hard to emphasize.
It is reported that the indictment that ultimately got filed may not have even been seen by the full grand jury. So let me repeat that. The grand jury that's supposed to approve the charges may not have seen the actual final version of the indictment. Now, to be clear, that's not a technicality or a clerical error. That's the basic foundation of whether a prosecution is valid at all. Fox News highlights a moment in court where Judge Nachmanoff actually asked whether the lead prosecutor, Lindsay Halligan, was basically acting as a puppet for Trump. The judge asked that because Lindsay Halligan, who brought the indictment, had almost no prosecutorial experience, and the timeline shows that she was brought in during a moment of very public and a very hostile conflict between Trump and Comey, with less than a week to bring on the indictment. Now, Fox News reported that the DOJ admitted that the only grand jury foreperson and maybe one other juror actually saw the indictment in its final form. The judge literally asked, how is that even possible? And quite frankly, that's a good question.
Well, a startling discussion. Less than 1 minute of time passed with no silence in this courtroom as the judge was able to ask the question and got the Justice Department to admit the final indictment that James Comey now faces, the former FBI director. It was never shown to the full grand jury in this courthouse, and they did not approve it in full. They had voted down indicting Comey because they had been asked to approve 3 different charges against him. That indictment was a no from the grand jury, and then there was no further discussion with the prosecutors to bring about the indictment Comey now faces. Judge Nachmanoff, after there were many arguments about Donald Trump directing the Justice Department, whether Lindsay Halligan, the prosecutor here, had acted on her own accord to decide to bring this indictment against Comey, Judge Nachmanoff, he began asking the prosecutor to explain why the documents in this case look the way this is, why there was missing time in the grand jury transcript. And then the judge asked the question, the operative indictment in this case, that document was never shown to the entire grand jury. That is when Tyler Lemons, the prosecutor, standing next to Lindsay Halligan, the U.S. attorney who was also seated at a counsel table, says, standing in front of you right now, no. There was silence in the courtroom. Judge Nachmanoff sat back in his chair. He looked down. He flipped pages that were in front of them. And then he asked again and stopped Tyler Lemons from answering, called Lindsay Halligan up to the podium. And she also confirmed, no, Your Honor, that the foreperson in open court was the person who had signed the final indictment against Comey. This was the very end of the arguments, the full set of arguments. This was like an additional thing the judge wanted to talk about. And so right after this, the defense counsel for James Comey, Michael Dreeben, he stood up and he said, it appears the operative indictment in this case was never shown to the grand jury and was never returned. That is the conclusion that they should draw, at least on the defense. He's trying to argue to the judge that this is an invalid case and should be outright dismissed.
You don't have to like James Comey to admit that the justice system is supposed to follow the rules. Comey made decisions that I believe were deeply wrong and even corrupt. But even so, based on the information that we know, the way that this prosecution was handled is raising alarms. If this case was mishandled because prosecutors were rushing or because the DOJ wanted to appease the president, that's unacceptable. I really hope that this wouldn't be the case in this indictment because I believe that James Comey deserves to be held accountable. But the optics here do not look good. You cannot prosecute someone out of revenge. You can't skip grand jury procedures just because you're confident that the person is guilty. Ultimately, you cannot appoint an inexperienced prosecutor in a high-stakes political case with missteps like the ones provided without expecting the judge to ask questions about your motive. Because even if you think that Comey deserves an indictment, which I believe he does, the process still has to be legitimate. But here is former White House attorney Ty Cobb speaking on the matter.
Now is Ty Cobb, former White House attorney in the first Trump administration. It's good to see you. Look, all of us knew that Ms. Halligan is not someone who is experienced, not at all experienced in these kinds of court cases. Nevertheless, what do you make of this latest reporting?
It's shocking. You couldn't find a high school stock boy at Home Depot who could have handled this more ineptly than Lindsay Halligan did. Taking an indictment that the grand jury never saw, having the foreman sign it, and then presenting it to a judge, that's the height of ineptitude and misconduct.
So when you say misconduct, let's talk about the implications for James Comey, because is it a procedural misstep that can be corrected, or is this denying a defendant due process?
It's both. But I think the interesting thing about this development is that there is no indictment, as Michael Dreeben, who is one of the country's most skilled advocates, has 100 Supreme Court arguments, made plain in court that there is no indictment. If only the foreman and some grand juror who was hanging out in the courtroom saw it, that's 2. A quorum is 12. You need a quorum to return an indictment. So the indictment that was presented and that they've been proceeding on really is a nullity, and that's potentially procedurally critical here, because typically, if an indictment is dismissed, the government has 6 months to represent, notwithstanding the expiration of the statute of limitations. This is an indictment, though, that doesn't really have to be dismissed. It doesn't really exist. It was never properly returned. So I think what we heard today, shocking, never occurred before in American jurisprudence. I think will be dispositive.
So here's where things stand today. Comey is asking the judge to throw out the indictment entirely. The judge's questions suggest that the DOJ may have a serious problem on its hand. And the hearing made one thing very clear. This case is not as simple as Comey got indicted, justice is served. It might end up being the opposite. The case might fall apart because the people in charge of it didn't do their job correctly. Or worse, because the prosecution was maybe influenced by political pressure. We'll have to wait and see what's ultimately decided. But do you think the Comey indictment was politically motivated? Do you think the DOJ botched the case? Or do you think that Comey should face trial regardless of the procedural problems? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, if honest commentary brings you value, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. And ring the little bell so you never miss an update. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.